The conference room fell into a suffocating silence as 8-year-old Park Ji-woo stood before 5 of Seoul's most powerful women, her small hands trembling against the silk of her black hanbok. Her father, Kang Minho, the man whose name alone could empty entire districts of Gangnam, had just asked her to do the impossible. Choose a mother. Choose from among these strangers who smelled of French perfume and ambition. Women whose smiles never quite reached their eyes. Women who had invaded her home 2 weeks ago with designer luggage and promises that tasted like lies. But Ji-woo's gaze kept drifting past them, past the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Seoul skyline, toward the doorway where a different woman stood in a simple gray uniform, dark hands clutching a cleaning cloth, eyes glistening with tears she was trying desperately to hide. Chioma Okafor, the Nigerian woman who sang lullabies in a language that sounded like rainfall, who braided Ji-woo's hair while whispering prayers to gods Ji-woo didn't know but somehow trusted, who was the only person in this cold mansion who made her feel like her mother's love hadn't died in that bullet-riddled car 14 months ago. What none of these wealthy women knew, what would shatter their carefully constructed plans and reveal the depths of their cruelty, was that this wasn't just about marriage. This was about time. About a little girl who was dying from the same genetic disease, and about a father desperate enough to test the souls of strangers to find one worthy of loving his daughter when he could no longer protect her. And about a humble housekeeper who had crossed an ocean and sacrificed everything to honor a promise made to a dying woman she'd known for only 2 weeks. This is the story of how prejudice, desperation, and an impossible choice collided in the heart of Seoul's criminal underworld, where the woman they all underestimated would become the only one capable of saving them all. If you're new to my channel, you're absolutely welcome here. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notification bell, because what happens next will leave you breathless. Trust me, you don't want to miss a single second of how this unfolds. 2 weeks earlier, Kang Minho had gathered the 5 women in his private study, the room where he'd ordered executions and brokered deals worth billions, and told them something that made their hearts race with possibility. My daughter will choose her new mother. You have 1 month. Live in this house. Show me, show her, who deserves to stand beside me. Park Yuna had smiled first, the chaebol heiress whose family fortune was built on oil and blood, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the armrest of the leather chair. At 32, she carried herself with the arrogance of old money, but Minho's private investigator had already uncovered the truth festering beneath her Chanel suits. $50 million in debt from her father's gambling addiction. Debt owned by her uncle Choi Dae-young, Minho's most dangerous rival, a man who would use that debt to force Yuna into a strategic marriage with a Chinese triad leader known for his brutality toward women. Beside her sat Jin Seo-yun, 35, one of Seoul's youngest prosecutors, her sharp eyes missing nothing, her reputation built on a perfect conviction rate. What she'd hidden from everyone was the blackmail eating her alive. Evidence that she'd falsified testimony to save an innocent 17-year-old from a murder charge. Evidence now in the hands of the very criminals she'd built her career destroying. Marriage to Minho meant protection, meant power enough to bury her sins forever. Dr. Han Mi-young occupied the chair nearest the window, 41, a renowned surgeon who'd once performed miracles in operating rooms across 3 countries. Until the night she'd fallen asleep during a procedure after being awake for 72 hours caring for her mother dying from dementia, and a patient had died. Her medical license revoked. Her mother, still dying, still needing round-the-clock care she could no longer afford. Minho's wealth could buy back everything she'd lost. Lee Da-hee, the 29-year-old actress whose face graced billboards throughout Asia, sat with her hands folded in her lap, covering the scars on her wrists that makeup couldn't quite hide. 3 suicide attempts after years of abuse from producers who treated her body like property. An agency contract that owned her until 2028. A life she was desperate to escape. Minho could break that contract with a single phone call. And Baek Ji-won, 38, the fashion mogul whose designs had dressed Korea's first lady, now bankrupted by an ex-husband who'd stolen her entire portfolio and left her with a 7-year-old disabled son who needed medical care she could no longer provide. Marriage to Minho meant survival for her child. 5 desperate women. 5 different kinds of drowning. 1 month to prove themselves worthy. What they didn't know was that Minho wasn't looking for a wife. He was looking for someone who could love his daughter in the time she had left. Chioma Okafor had arrived at the Kong mansion 3 months before the competition began, recommended by an agency that specialized in placing foreign domestic workers. She'd stood in Minho's office wearing a borrowed interview suit, her Nigerian accent thick as she'd answered his questions in careful Korean. Her credentials modest, high school education, 5 years of housekeeping experience, impeccable references. All lies. The truth was far more complicated, far more dangerous, and it would remain hidden in her small servant's quarters, locked in a drawer beneath folded clothes that still smelled of Lagos. A PhD diploma in child psychology from Yonsei University, published research on grief therapy for orphan children, recommendation letters from professors who'd called her brilliant, and a worn photograph of her standing beside a Korean woman in a Nigerian grief counseling center, both of them laughing, wearing matching Ankara fabric. The Korean woman in that photograph was Ji-woo's mother, Park Hye-jin, who had traveled to Lagos 3 years ago for charity work and met Chioma during a volunteer session. 2 weeks of late-night conversations about loss, about children, about the genetic disease that was slowly killing Hye-jin and would one day threaten her daughter. 2 weeks that had ended with Hye-jin gripping Chioma's hands and whispering a request that had seemed impossible. If anything happens to me, find my daughter. I've dreamed of you singing over her. I don't understand it, but I trust it. Promise me. Chioma had promised. And when news reached her 18 months later that Park Hye-jin had died in an assassination attempt meant for her husband, Chioma had abandoned her career, her research, her life, and had deliberately applied to work in Kang Minho's household as a maid, taking a position so far beneath her education that her professors had wept when she told them. But there was another reason Chioma needed this specific job, another secret that kept her working 16-hour days for wages that barely covered her expenses. Her younger brother, Chikwudi, 23, was dying of leukemia in a Lagos hospital, his treatment costing money she didn't have, his condition deteriorating with each passing week. Every dollar she earned scrubbing floors in Seoul was a few more days of life for the brother who'd raised her after their parents died. 2 impossible promises. 2 lives hanging in the balance. And Chioma, carrying the weight of both, had walked into the Kang mansion and immediately recognized Ji-woo. Her mother's eyes, her mother's smile, her mother's grief. The 5 candidates had arrived on a Monday morning, their presence transforming the mansion into a battlefield disguised as a beauty pageant. Park Yuna had claimed the master guest suite on the 2nd floor, the one with the view of the garden where Ji-woo played. Jin Seo-yun had taken the room nearest Minho's office, strategic positioning for a woman who understood that proximity to power mattered. Dr. Han Mi-young, Lee De-hee, and Baek Ji-won had spread themselves throughout the mansion's west wing, each carving out territory like generals planning a siege. And from the very first dinner, they had identified their common enemy. That girl, Park Yuna had whispered over wine in the private library that first night, her voice dripping with venom as she'd watched through the window where Chioma was teaching Ji-woo to jump rope in the garden, both of them laughing. Needs to understand her place. She's just the help, Jin Seo-yun had replied, but her eyes betrayed her concern. Why does Ji-woo spend so much time with her? Dr. Han Mi-young had set down her glass with deliberate precision. Because the child doesn't know any better. She's been allowed to form inappropriate attachments. It's our responsibility to correct that. Lee De-hee had nodded, her actress training making her face sympathetic even as her words cut like knives. For Ji-woo's own good, really. She needs to learn about proper social hierarchies now, while she's young, before those associations damage her future. Baek Ji-won had been the most direct. Let's stop dancing around it. The problem is that a black cleaning lady is taking up emotional space that should belong to one of us. We need to fix that. Quickly. What none of them had noticed was the small security camera hidden in the library's antique lamp, or the fact that every word they'd spoken was being recorded in Minho's private server, or that their carefully constructed masks of maternal concern were already beginning to crack. Ji-woo had nightmares, terrible ones that left her screaming in the dark, trapped in memories of her mother's car being riddled with bullets meant for her father, of blood on shattered glass, of a hand going limp in hers. The nightmares had started the week after the funeral and hadn't stopped for 14 months. Until Chioma. The first time it happened, Chioma had been cleaning the hallway outside Jiwoo's bedroom at 2 in the morning. Minho's instructions were that someone needed to be nearby at all times. When she'd heard the screaming, she'd burst through the door to find Jiwoo thrashing in sweat-soaked sheets. The 5 candidates standing frozen in the doorway in their silk pajamas. Expressions ranging from horror to disgust to carefully constructed concern that looked more like a performance than genuine emotion. Chioma hadn't hesitated. She'd swept Jiwoo into her arms and begun singing, not in Korean, but in Igbo, an ancient warrior song her grandmother had taught her about women who survived impossible wars, who carried grief like armor and transformed it into strength. Her voice had filled the room with something the expensive furniture and designer decorations could never provide. The sound of a soul that understood suffering and had chosen love anyway. Jiwoo's screaming had faded to whimpers, then to silence, then to soft breathing as she'd fallen asleep against Chioma's chest, tiny fingers clutching the fabric of her uniform. "Well," Park Yuna had said into the silence, her voice sharp enough to cut. "I suppose that's one way to handle it, though a proper mother would establish better sleep discipline rather than coddling." "Get out," Minho had said from behind them, his voice quiet and absolutely deadly. He'd been watching from the security room, had seen everything. The frozen candidates, Chioma's instant response, his daughter's first peaceful sleep in over a year. "All of you, now." They'd left, but not before Chioma had caught the look that passed between them. It wasn't just dislike anymore. It was war. The next morning, Jiwoo had woken up in Chioma's small servants' quarters, wrapped in her arms, both of them wearing matching Ankara fabric head wraps that Chioma had made. Through the security cameras, Minho had watched his daughter smile, truly smile, for the first time since her mother's death. And he'd made a decision that would change everything. He'd pulled Chioma's full file. Not the fake one the agency had provided, but the real one his investigator had uncovered. PhD in child psychology. Graduated top of her class. Published research that had changed therapeutic approaches for grieving children across 3 continents. Recommendations from professors who'd called her once-in-a-generation brilliant. Working as his maid. The question wasn't why she'd lied about her credentials. The question was why she was here at all. Minho had spent 14 months buried in grief and rage, building walls between himself and anything that could hurt him worse than losing his wife already had. But watching Chioma with Jiwoo, seeing his daughter's nightmares finally quiet, he'd felt something crack in his chest. Not breaking, but opening. He'd called his head of security. "I want to know everything about Chioma Okafor. Everything. And I want it by tonight." What he would discover would shatter every assumption he'd made, reveal a conspiracy that went back years, and force him to confront a truth he'd been avoiding since the day his wife died. That love wasn't about wealth or status or protection. It was about showing up. About singing in the dark. About a promise kept across an ocean to a dying woman who'd somehow known that this would be exactly what her daughter needed. But first, the 5 candidates would make their move. And it would be crueler than anything Minho could have imagined. The attack came during breakfast on Wednesday morning, orchestrated with the precision of a military operation and the cruelty of people who had convinced themselves that their desperation justified anything. Park Yuna had risen early, her hair already perfectly styled, her makeup applied with the care of someone preparing for battle. She'd gathered the other 4 women in Jin Seo-yun's room at 6 a.m., spreading documents across the bed like battle plans. "We need to be strategic," Yuna had said, her diamond earrings catching the early light as she'd pointed to a printed schedule of Jiwoo's daily routine. "The child spends 2 hours every morning with that woman before any of us are even awake. 2 hours of influence we can't monitor or control." Jin Seo-yun had opened her leather notebook, her prosecutor's mind already mapping the legal angles. "I've researched Korean labor law. An employer can terminate domestic staff for cultural incompatibility without any legal repercussions. We just need to document behaviors that demonstrate she's creating an unhealthy attachment that's inappropriate for Jiwoo's social development." Dr. Han Myung had laughed, the sound bitter. "Cultural incompatibility. That's a polite way of saying what we're all thinking. Which is, Lee Dehee had asked, though her face suggested she already knew the answer. That Jiwoo is forming bonds with someone so far outside her social class that it's damaging her understanding of appropriate relationships. Baek Ji-won had answered bluntly. The girl needs to learn early about the difference between staff and family. Between people who serve and people who lead. Between us and her. Yuna had finished, not bothering to hide the ugly truth anymore. Let's stop pretending this is about anything other than what it is. That black woman is taking emotional space that belongs to one of us. Jiwoo should be clinging to me, or to one of you, not to the help. The silence that had followed was heavy with agreement and shame in equal measure. They all knew what they were doing. They all knew it was wrong. But desperation had a way of making people justify anything, and each of them was drowning in their own version of it. What they didn't know was that Chioma had grown up hearing conversations exactly like this one. Her mother had worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families in Charleston, South Carolina, for 30 years, and Chioma had been 14 when she'd witnessed her mother being fired after 2 decades of impeccable service simply because the employer's son had become too attached to her. The veiled accusation of not knowing her place had echoed through those mansion halls, and Chioma had sworn she would never be her mother, voiceless, powerless, broken by people who saw her as less than human. She'd gotten her education as a declaration of war against that system. Every degree, every publication, every award had been a middle finger to everyone who tried to convince her that people like her belonged in servitude. And now, 14 years later, she was choosing to be in that exact position. Not because she had to, because she'd promised. Because Jiwoo needed her. Because sometimes the most radical act of resistance wasn't fighting back. It was loving so fiercely that you became willing to endure anything. But Chioma wasn't just enduring. She was watching, learning, waiting. And when these women finally made their move, she would be ready. The setup happened at 10 a.m. in the mansion's formal dining room, where Minho had insisted all meals be taken together so he could observe how the candidates interacted with Jiwoo. Park Yuna had intercepted Jiwoo in the hallway as the child ran toward the kitchen, where Chioma was preparing her favorite snack, freshly baked chin-chin, a Nigerian treat that had become their special tradition. Jiwoo, sweetie, Yuna had said, her voice dripping with manufactured warmth as she'd knelt to the child's eye level. I brought something very special for you from Paris. A chess set carved from Italian marble. Would you like to learn how to play? It's a game for very intelligent children. Jiwoo had tried to step around her, clearly uncomfortable. I don't know how to play chess, Aunt Yuna. Maybe later. That's exactly why you need to learn now, Jin Seo-yun had said, appearing from the dining room to block the hallway from the other direction. Intellectual development is crucial at your age. Games like chess teach strategic thinking, which is important for children from prominent families. But Chioma taught me how to play AO yesterday, Jiwoo had replied, referencing the traditional African strategy game Chioma had carved from wood during her breaks. She said games help you think better no matter what they are. The temperature in the hallway had dropped 10 degrees. Dr. Han Mi-young had exchanged a loaded glance with Lee Dehee, and something unspoken had passed between them. A signal. A confirmation that they were right to be worried about Chioma's influence. Darling, Dehee had said, using her actress training to make her voice sound gentle and concerned. There's a difference between different types of games. Some are more appropriate for certain people. Chess is a game of kings and queens, of strategy and nobility. It's important for someone of your background to understand these distinctions. Jiwoo's face had scrunched up in confusion. But Chioma said all games are equal if they make you smarter. She said people who think some games are better than others are usually just scared they'll lose. The adults had gone silent, and in that silence, something dangerous had begun to bloom. The realization that this 8-year-old child, through Chioma's influence, was already learning to question the hierarchies they desperately needed her to accept. That's when Chioma had appeared in the kitchen doorway, carrying a tray of still warm chin-chin dusted with sugar. Her expression serene but her dark eyes missing nothing. She'd heard every word. Excuse me for interrupting, she'd said in her careful Korean. The accent that the 5 women loved to mock behind her back. The politeness that bordered on perfection. Jiwoo, your treat is ready. I made extra for after dinner, just like you asked. Jiwoo's entire face had lit up like Seoul's skyline at night. Chioma, did you make the butterfly shapes like you promised? I did, my precious girl, Chioma had replied, and the endearment had hung in the air like a declaration of war. I even saved some dough so we can make more together this afternoon, if you'd like. The child had darted past the 5 women without a second glance, throwing her arms around Chioma's waist with the unself-conscious affection of someone who'd never been taught that love required permission or came with conditions. Park Yuna had watched the interaction with barely concealed fury, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms hard enough to leave marks. Chioma, Yuna had said, testing out the maid's name for the first time but pronouncing it wrong, Toma instead of Chioma, as if the extra syllable made it foreign and therefore lesser. Don't you think you're taking on too much responsibility with Jiwoo? We're here specifically to handle her developmental needs. Perhaps it would be better if you focused on your actual duties. Chioma had smiled politely, but something had flashed in her dark eyes, something that suggested she understood exactly what was happening and was choosing her response with surgical precision. Of course, Mississippi Park, she'd replied, her voice maintaining that same dangerous sweetness. I'm only following Mr. Kang's specific instructions to keep Jiwoo fed, happy, and emotionally secure. If those priorities have changed, he'll need to tell me directly. It was the perfect response. Deferential enough to seem respectful, specific enough to remind them that she answered to Minho, not to them, and pointed enough to suggest she knew exactly what they were trying to do. Jin Seo-yun had stepped forward, her prosecutor's instincts recognizing a worthy opponent when she saw one. Feeding is one thing, but forming emotional bonds is quite another. There needs to be appropriate professional distance between staff and family members. I'm sure you understand why. I understand perfectly, Chioma had said, her smile never wavering even as her words carried edges sharp enough to cut. I've always been taught that caring for children means giving them exactly what they need, when they need it. And right now, Jiwoo needs consistency, safety, and unconditional love while she processes her grief. That's not a professional boundary issue. That's basic child psychology. The casual mention of psychology had made Dr. Han Myung's eyes narrow. You seem very informed about child development for someone whose resume lists only housekeeping experience. I read, Chioma had replied simply, and I listen. Children teach you everything you need to know if you're willing to pay attention. Baek Ji-won had made a small sound of frustration. The point is that Jiwoo needs guidance from people who understand her social position, her future responsibilities, her place in Seoul society. No offense, but you can't provide that kind of direction. You're right, Chioma had said, and for a moment the 5 women had relaxed, thinking they'd finally gotten through to her. I can't teach Jiwoo about Seoul's high society or business strategy or political connections. But I can teach her something far more important, how to recognize people who genuinely love her versus people who see her as a means to an end. Children are remarkably good at learning that distinction, don't you think? The silence that had followed was absolutely deafening. Lee De-hee had been the first to recover, her actress training kicking in to smooth over the confrontation. Well, this has been quite the philosophical discussion. Jiwoo, why don't you come eat your breakfast with us in the dining room? We have so much we'd love to talk to you about. But Jiwoo had already taken a piece of chin-chin from Chioma's tray and was chewing contentedly, her small hand wrapped around Chioma's fingers. I want to eat with Chioma in the kitchen, the child had announced with the brutal honesty only 8-year-olds possess. You ladies make me feel like I'm being interviewed instead of having breakfast. Chioma makes me feel like I'm home. And with that devastating assessment, Jiwoo had pulled Chioma back toward the kitchen, leaving 5 of Seoul's most powerful women standing in the hallway, their carefully constructed plans crumbling around them like poorly mixed concrete. What none of them knew was that Minho had watched the entire interaction through the hidden cameras, and for the first time since his wife's death, he'd felt something close to hope. Not because Chioma had defended herself, though that had been impressive, but because she'd defended his daughter. Because she'd seen through their manipulation immediately and had responded not with anger or indignation, but with the calm certainty of someone who knew her worth and didn't need their validation. And because Ji-woo, his precious daughter who'd been so careful and quiet since losing her mother, had just told 5 wealthy strangers that a Nigerian housekeeper made her feel more at home than any of them ever could. Minho had picked up his phone and called his head of security. "Marcus, I need that full report on Chioma Okafor now. Not tonight. Now. And I need you to dig deeper into the 5 candidates. I want to know what they're really running from, what they're really desperate for. Because women that threatened by a maid aren't competing for love. They're competing for survival. Find out why." That afternoon, while Chioma and Ji-woo made butterfly-shaped chin-chin in the kitchen, singing Igbo songs and Korean nursery rhymes in equal measure, the 5 candidates held an emergency meeting in Park Yuna's suite. "This is getting out of control," Yuna had hissed, pacing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. "That woman just challenged us, in front of the child, and Ji-woo chose her over all of us combined. We need documentation," Jin So-yeon had said, already typing on her laptop. "I'm creating a detailed behavioral report. Allegations of overstepping professional boundaries, creating unhealthy dependencies, potentially alienating Ji-woo from appropriate social connections. We present it to Minho as concerned observations from multiple educated professionals." Dr. Han Myung had nodded approvingly. "I can add medical concerns. As a former surgeon, I can frame it as worry about the psychological impact of Ji-woo forming primary attachments to temporary staff members. The instability, the inevitable loss when the staff member leaves. It's actually quite damaging for a child who's already experienced maternal death." "That's perfect," Baek Ji-won had said. "It's not racism or classism. It's legitimate professional concern for Ji-woo's well-being. How can Minho argue with that?" Lee Da-hee had been quiet, staring out the window at the garden where Chioma and Ji-woo were now playing, their laughter drifting up through the open windows. "What if we're wrong?" she'd whispered. The room had gone silent. "What?" Yuna had snapped. "What if we're wrong about her?" Da-hee had repeated, louder this time. "What if she actually cares about Ji-woo? What if what we're seeing isn't manipulation or boundary violation? What if it's just love? Then she should have been born into the right social class to express it," Yuna had said coldly. "Love doesn't change reality. And the reality is that one of us needs to marry Minho, which means Ji-woo needs to bond with one of us. Chioma is in the way. That's not cruelty. That's just facts." "Facts." Jin So-yeon had agreed, typing faster. "Cold, hard, necessary facts." But as they'd continued planning their assault on Chioma's position, none of them had noticed the small device hidden in the decorative lamp on Yuna's dresser. A listening device that Marcus Thompson, Minho's head of security, had installed 2 days earlier. Every word they spoke was being recorded. Every cruel justification. Every calculated plan. Every moment they revealed exactly who they were beneath their designer clothes and charitable donations and carefully constructed public personas. And in his office 3 floors below, Minho listened to it all, his expression growing darker with each passing minute. The call came at 3 in the morning, vibrating against the small wooden table in Chioma's servant quarters with an urgency that could only mean one thing. She'd grabbed the phone before the second ring, her heart already racing, already knowing. "Chioma." Her sister Diane's voice had been tight with barely controlled emotion, calling from her apartment in Washington, D.C., where she worked as a producer for CNN. "It's Chikwudi. The doctors say he has maybe 2 weeks. 3 at most. The treatment isn't working anymore." Chioma had pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from making a sound that would wake Ji-woo, who'd had another nightmare and was sleeping in Chioma's bed, small fingers still clutching the edge of Chioma's nightshirt even in sleep. "How much?" Chioma had whispered into the phone, though she already knew the answer would be impossible. $500,000 for the experimental treatment. This is only chance. Without it, Diane's voice had cracked. Without it, our baby brother dies. He dies alone in that Lagos hospital, while we're thousands of miles away building careers, and trying to prove we're worth something to a world that will never see us as equal. Chioma had looked at Ji-woo sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks, then at the photograph of her brother on her nightstand. Chikwudi at his university graduation, brilliant and young and full of hope, before the leukemia had turned his body into a battlefield. Two people she loved. Two impossible promises. One heart being torn in directions that would destroy her no matter which way she chose. "I'll figure something out," Chioma had said, though she had no idea how. Her salary barely covered her brother's current treatment, let alone $500,000 for experimental therapy. "Just tell him I love him. Tell him his big sister is fighting for him." "Are you though?" Diane had asked, and the question had carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. "Because from where I'm standing, you're in Seoul playing nanny to some rich man's daughter while our brother dies. For what, Chi? For some promise you made to a stranger? For a job that pays you minimum wage to scrub toilets? When does our family matter more than your savior complex?" The words had hit like physical blows, each one true and unfair in equal measure. "It's not like that," Chioma had whispered. "Ji-woo needs. Chikwudi is dying." Diane had shouted, then immediately lowered her voice, remembering the late hour. "Our brother, our blood, our family. He needs you, Chioma. He's asking for you. And you're choosing someone else's child over him." Chioma had closed her eyes against tears that burned like acid. "I promised her mother. I gave my word." "And what about the word you gave to Mama before she died? That we'd take care of each other? That family comes first? Or does that only count when it's convenient?" The call had ended shortly after, leaving Chioma sitting in the dark with a sleeping child in her bed, and her baby brother dying an ocean away, and no possible way to save them both. She hadn't known that Ji-woo was awake, that the child had heard everything through the thin walls, that tomorrow morning, everything would change in ways none of them could predict. Ji-woo had appeared at breakfast the next morning with her piggy bank, a ceramic tiger her mother had given her for her 6th birthday, and had walked directly past all 5 candidates sitting at the formal dining table, their carefully prepared greetings dying on their lips as the child had set the piggy bank on the counter where Chioma was preparing fruit. "Chioma," Ji-woo had said in Korean, her voice carrying the kind of fierce determination that came from her father's blood. "I heard you crying last night. I heard you talking about your brother." Chioma had frozen, the knife still in her hand, her heart stopping completely. "Ji-woo, sweetie, you shouldn't." "How much does he need?" the child had interrupted. "For the medicine that will make him better?" From the dining room, Park Yuna had perked up, sensing opportunity in the sudden tension. The other 4 women had leaned forward, their breakfast forgotten, their predatory instincts activated by the scent of vulnerability. "It's not something you need to worry about," Chioma had said gently, setting down the knife and kneeling to Ji-woo's eye level. "Your kindness means everything. But I have money," Ji-woo had insisted, shaking the piggy bank so the coins rattled inside. "Mama gave me this. She said to use it for something important. Saving your brother is important." Chioma's vision had blurred with tears she couldn't control. "Oh, my precious girl. Is it enough?" Ji-woo had asked, and the heartbreaking hope in her voice had shattered something fundamental in Chioma's chest. "I have $247. I counted. Is that enough to save him?" The silence that had filled the mansion had been absolute. Even the 5 candidates had gone quiet, watching this exchange with expressions ranging from calculation to something that might have been shame if any of them still had access to that emotion. "No, darling," Chioma had whispered, pulling Ji-woo into her arms. "It's not enough. But the fact that you would offer, that you would give everything you have to help someone you've never met, that's worth more than any amount of money." "Then I'll get more," Ji-woo had declared with the absolute certainty of children, who haven't yet learned that some problems can't be solved with determination alone. "I'll ask Appa. He has lots of money. He'll help." "Ji-woo, you can't?" Chioma had started, but the child had already pulled away, running toward Minho's office with her piggy bank clutched to her chest, leaving Chioma kneeling on the kitchen floor, tears streaming down her face, completely exposed. Park Yuna had been the first to speak, her voice carrying across the dining room with surgical precision. "How touching. The help's family problems are now our concern, apparently. It's completely inappropriate," Jin Seo-yun had added, her prosecutor's mind already weaponizing what she just witnessed. Using a child's compassion to manipulate sympathy, creating situations where Jiwoo feels responsible for solving adult problems. This is exactly the kind of boundary violation I was documenting. Dr. Han Myung had nodded sagely. From a psychological perspective, this is deeply concerning. Jiwoo is being conditioned to prioritize the emotional needs of staff over her own well-being. It's a form of parentification, honestly. The child is being forced into a caretaking role that's entirely inappropriate for her developmental stage. Lee Dae-hee had looked uncomfortable but hadn't contradicted them. Baek Ji-won had simply watched Chioma with an expression that was hard to read. Something between pity and contempt and recognition of a desperation that matched her own. Chioma had slowly stood, wiping her face with the back of her hand, and when she turned to face the 5 women, her expression had been completely serene. "You're right," she'd said quietly. "This is inappropriate. I apologize for the disruption to your morning. It won't happen again." She'd walked out of the kitchen with her head high and her spine straight, and the 5 women had exchanged satisfied glances, certain they'd just witnessed the beginning of Chioma's inevitable downfall. What none of them had seen was the look on Minho's face as he'd watched the entire scene through the security cameras, or the way his hands had clenched into fists as he'd heard them weaponize his daughter's compassion against the one person who'd actually taught her what compassion meant. Jiwoo had burst into her father's office without knocking, something she only did when something was desperately important, and had climbed onto his lap with her piggy bank still clutched in her small hands. "Appa," she'd said, looking up at him with eyes that were exactly like her mother's, dark and deep and capable of seeing straight through to the truth of things. "Chioma's brother is dying. He needs medicine that costs lots of money. Can we help him?" Minho had felt something crack in his chest. Not breaking, but opening wider, like a door he'd kept locked since his wife's death, suddenly swinging free. "How do you know about Chioma's brother?" he'd asked gently. "I heard her crying last night. She was talking to her sister. Her brother only has 2 weeks, maybe 3. And Chioma has to choose between staying here with me or going to be with him before he dies. But she's staying with me because she promised my mama she would take care of me." Jiwoo's voice had gotten smaller, more uncertain. "That's not fair, is it, Appa? That she has to choose." Minho had pulled his daughter closer, burying his face in her hair that smelled like the jasmine shampoo Chioma used when she washed it. "No, sweetheart. That's not fair at all. So can we help? Can we pay for the medicine so her brother doesn't die and Chioma doesn't have to choose?" And there it was, the question that forced Minho to confront something he'd been avoiding for 3 months. He'd hired investigators to dig into Chioma's background. He knew about her PhD, her research, her published work on grief therapy for children. He knew she was wildly overqualified to be scrubbing his floors. He knew she'd given up everything to honor some promise to his dead wife. What he hadn't known until this moment was that she'd been making that sacrifice while her own brother was dying. That every day she stayed in Seoul singing lullabies to his daughter was a day she wasn't spending with her own family. That her kindness toward Jiwoo wasn't coming from a place of abundance, but from a place of devastating loss. "Yes," Minho had said quietly. "We can help. I'll make the calls today." Jiwoo had thrown her arms around his neck. "Thank you, Appa. Thank you. Can I tell her? Please." "Not yet," Minho had said, and there had been something in his voice that made Jiwoo pull back to look at him curiously. "I need to talk to Chioma first. About a lot of things. But yes, baby, we'll help her brother. I promise." After Jiwoo had left, skipping with relief, Minho had sat in his office staring at the security monitors that showed Chioma in her small room, packing a bag with shaking hands, clearly preparing to leave. She was going to quit, going to sacrifice his daughter's healing to be with her dying brother, even though it would mean breaking the promise she'd made to his wife, even though it would devastate Jiwoo. Even though it would likely cost her brother's life since she'd never reach Lagos in time and didn't have money for the treatment anyway. She was choosing family over duty, love over promise. And Minho realized with sudden, crystalline clarity that this was exactly why his wife had chosen her. Because Chioma understood that sometimes the right choice was the one that destroyed you. That love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect solutions. It was about showing up in the broken places and staying there even when it cost you everything. He'd picked up his phone and made 3 calls. The first was to his private banking contact in Switzerland, authorizing a wire transfer of $500,000 to a Lagos hospital with instructions that it be allocated to Chikwudi Okafor's experimental treatment. The second was to his aviation company, arranging for his private jet to be fueled and ready for a flight to Lagos within 6 hours. The third was to Marcus Thompson, his head of security. Marcus, I need the full files on all 5 candidates. Everything you've found. And I need Chioma's complete background, not just the professional credentials, but everything about her connection to my wife. I want the truth. All of it. Because I think I've been running the wrong competition this entire time. Chioma had been folding her clothes into a worn duffel bag when the knock came on her door. She'd wiped her face quickly, expecting Ji-woo. But when she'd opened the door, Minho had been standing there, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Kong," she'd said, automatically bowing slightly. "I was just about to come find you. I need to submit my resignation." "Your brother's treatment has been paid for," Minho had interrupted. $500,000 has been wired to Lagos Memorial Hospital with instructions for the experimental leukemia therapy. The doctors will begin treatment tomorrow morning. Chioma had stared at him, her brain unable to process the words. What? My jet is being prepared. You'll fly to Lagos tonight. You'll be with your brother for the treatment. You'll stay as long as he needs you. I can't. I don't have that kind of money. I can't possibly. It's not a loan, Minho had said quietly. It's a gift. From my family to yours. Chioma's legs had given out, and she'd sat down hard on the edge of her narrow bed, her hands shaking so violently she'd had to clasp them together. "Why?" she'd whispered. "Why would you do this?" Minho had stepped into the small room, closing the door behind him, and had pulled out a photograph, the one from Chioma's drawer of her standing with his wife in Lagos, both of them laughing. "Because my wife chose you," he'd said simply. 3 years before she died. She met you and somehow knew that you were the person who would save our daughter when I couldn't. She made you promise to find Ji-woo. Didn't she? Chioma had nodded, unable to speak. And you came here, gave up your career, your research, your life, to honor a promise made to a woman you knew for 2 weeks, while your own brother was dying. Minho's voice had been rough with emotion. That's not duty, that's love. And Ji-woo deserves to be raised by someone who understands that kind of love. The candidates are desperate women making cruel choices because they're drowning, Minho had said. I've heard everything they've said about you, seen everything they've done, and I've realized that I've been asking the wrong question this entire time. What question should you have been asking? Not who wants to marry me? But, who loves my daughter enough to choose her even when it costs them everything? Minho had looked directly into Chioma's eyes. You already answered that question. You've been answering it every day for 3 months. Chioma had stood, backing away slightly, her heart hammering. Mr. Kong, I think you're misunderstanding. Am I? He'd stepped closer. Ji-woo calls you home. She sleeps through the night for the first time in 14 months when you sing to her. She offered you every penny she has to save your brother. That child loves you, Chioma. And unless I'm completely wrong, which I rarely am, you love her too. Of course I love her, Chioma had whispered. But that doesn't mean. It means everything, Minho had interrupted. Because love is the only thing that matters. Not money, not status, not any of the things I thought I was looking for. Just love. The silence between them had stretched, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to name. Finally, Chioma had spoken, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Your wife made me promise I would protect Ji-woo, teach her that love transcends blood and borders and the color of skin. She said she dreamed of me singing over her daughter, and even though she didn't understand it, she trusted it. Chioma had looked up at Minho. I'm honoring that promise. Not for money, not for position, because your wife saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, the ability to love a child who isn't mine as fiercely as if she were. I know, Minho had said quietly. And that's exactly why I'm asking you to go to Lagos. Be with your brother. Save him. Because the woman I want raising my daughter is someone who understands that love means showing up for your family even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. What about Jiwoo? The separation anxiety. We'll handle it together. I'll explain everything to her. We'll video call every day. And when you come back... Minho had paused. When you come back, we need to have a very serious conversation about your future in this house. Chioma had looked at him searchingly. The candidates can go to hell, Minho had said bluntly. All 5 of them. I've made my choice. Jiwoo made her choice 3 months ago. Now it's just a question of whether you'll accept it. Before Chioma could respond, Jiwoo had burst through the door, having clearly been listening from the hallway. Chioma! The child had shouted, throwing herself into Chioma's arms. Appa's sending you to save your brother. You don't have to choose anymore. Chioma had held Jiwoo tight, her tears falling into the child's hair. And over Jiwoo's head, she'd met Minho's eyes with an expression that held gratitude and fear and hope and love all tangled together in a knot too complex to untie. Thank you, she'd whispered, for giving me this gift, for understanding. Thank your daughter, Minho had replied. She's the one who taught me what really matters. What none of them knew was that Park Yuna was watching through the partially open door, her face twisted with rage and desperation. That she was already texting her uncle Choi Dae-young with an update that would set catastrophic events in motion. That the war they'd been fighting in whispers and social sabotage was about to become something far more dangerous. Because desperate people do desperate things. And Yuna had just realized she was losing the only escape route she had. Chioma's flight to Lagos left at midnight, and Jiwoo had insisted on staying awake to say goodbye at the mansion's private helipad. The child had stood in her pajamas, wrapped in one of Chioma's Ankara fabric blankets, watching as Minho's helicopter prepared to take Chioma to Incheon International Airport. You promise you'll come back? Jiwoo had asked for the 7th time, her small hand gripping Chioma's fingers with desperate strength. I promise, my precious girl, Chioma had whispered, kneeling down to press their foreheads together in the traditional Igbo blessing her grandmother had taught her. Chinik will watch over you while I'm gone. And we'll talk every single day, yes? You'll tell me about school and your games, and I'll tell you about Lagos and my brother. Will you sing to me? On the phone. When I have nightmares. Every single time. Chioma had promised, her voice breaking. Distance doesn't change love, Jiwoo. Remember that. Love lives in here. She'd pressed her hand to Jiwoo's chest. Not in how close our bodies are. Minho had watched this goodbye from a few feet away, his security team discreetly positioned around the helipad's perimeter, and he'd felt something shift fundamentally in his understanding of what family meant. This wasn't about blood or marriage certificates or legal documents. This was about 2 souls who'd found each other across impossible circumstances and had chosen to love each other anyway. The 5 candidates had watched from the mansion's upper windows, their faces illuminated by the helicopter's lights, and each wore a different expression of calculation. They'd heard through the household staff that Minho had paid for Chioma's brother's treatment, $500,000 for a maid's family member. The implications were clear and terrifying. He's in love with her, Lee Dae had whispered, her actress instincts reading the body language on the helipad with perfect clarity. Look at how he's looking at her. That's not gratitude or respect. That's something else entirely. Don't be ridiculous, Park Yuna had snapped, but her voice had carried an edge of panic. She's the help. He's just being generous because Jiwoo is attached to her. Once she's gone for a few weeks, the child will forget. Children are resilient. But Jin Seo-yun had been watching Jiwoo's face through binoculars, and what she'd seen had sent ice through her veins. That child isn't going to forget. Look at her. She's devastated. And Minho looks like he's sending away part of his family, not dismissing an employee. Dr. Han Myung had set down her wine glass with a sharp click. Then we need to act now, while Chioma is gone. We have maybe 3 weeks before she returns. 3 weeks to make ourselves indispensable to Jiwoo, to prove we can provide everything that woman was providing, but with the added benefits of our education, our connections, our appropriate social positioning. How? Baek Ji-won had asked. The child barely tolerates us. She runs away every time we try to engage with her. Because we've been competing with each other, Yuna had said, her mind already racing through strategies. We need to work together. Present a united front. Show Minho that 5 accomplished women can provide better care than one foreign maid ever could. What they didn't realize was that Marcus Thompson had installed additional surveillance equipment in every room after overhearing their first conspiracy. Every word they spoke was being recorded, catalogued, and would soon be used in ways they couldn't possibly anticipate. The text message had arrived on Park Yuna's phone 30 minutes after Chioma's helicopter disappeared into Seoul's night sky. From her uncle, Choi Dae-young. Sokong Minho just wired $500,000 to Lagos for a maid's brother. Interesting. Very interesting. We need to talk. Tomorrow. My office. Come alone. Yuna had stared at the message, her stomach churning with dread and dark hope in equal measure. Her uncle was the most dangerous man in Seoul's underworld, the one who'd orchestrated the assassination of Minho's wife, though that fact was known only to a select few. The one who owned Yuna's family debt and was planning to sell her to a Chinese triad leader known for his brutality toward women. But he was also the one man who might have the resources and ruthlessness to change the trajectory of this competition entirely. She texted back, "What are you thinking?" The response had been immediate. That Kong Minho has finally shown a weakness. And weaknesses can be exploited. See you tomorrow. Yuna had deleted the messages and returned to watching the helipad, where Minho was carrying a sleeping Jiwoo back toward the mansion, the child's face buried in his shoulder, still clutching the Ankara blanket Chioma had wrapped her in. Tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow the game would stop being about seduction and start being about survival. Tomorrow the real war would begin. In Lagos, Chioma had arrived at the hospital to find her brother Chikwudi barely conscious, his body ravaged by the leukemia that had been eating him alive for 18 months. But when he'd seen her walk through the door of his hospital room, his eyes had filled with tears. "Chi," he'd whispered in Igbo, their mother tongue feeling like coming home after months of speaking careful Korean. "You came. I didn't think. They said you were in Korea. Nothing could have kept me away," Chioma had said, taking his skeletal hand in hers, shocked by how much weight he'd lost, how fragile he looked. "And we have good news. The experimental treatment, it's been paid for. You start tomorrow." Chikwudi had closed his eyes, more tears slipping down his gaunt cheeks. "How? We don't have that kind of money. Did you sell everything?" "Chi, you shouldn't have." "I didn't sell anything," she'd interrupted gently. "Someone gave it to us. As a gift. Who would give us $500,000? Chioma had smiled through her own tears. "A little girl with a piggy bank who heard me crying and wanted to help. And her father who understood what it means to love someone enough to sacrifice everything." She'd spent the next hour telling Chikwudi everything. About Jiwoo. About the promise she'd made to Hygiene. About the 5 candidates and their cruelty. About Minho's unexpected generosity. And Chikwudi, despite his weakness, had listened with the sharp intelligence that had earned him a full scholarship to university before the cancer had stolen his future. "This man," he'd said finally. "Minho. He loves you. Don't be ridiculous," Chioma had protested. "He's grateful because I've been helping his daughter." "No," Chikwudi had interrupted with the certainty of someone who could see truth clearly because he was close enough to death to recognize what mattered. "Men like that, powerful men, dangerous men, they don't give away $500,000 for gratitude. They do it for love. The question is whether you love him back." Chioma had opened her mouth to deny it, but the words had stuck in her throat. Because somewhere between singing lullabies and braiding hair and teaching Jiwoo that love transcended borders and skin color, she'd fallen in love with both the child and the father, with the way Minho watched his daughter with fierce protectiveness, with the way he'd listened when she'd stood up to the 5 candidates, with the way he'd seen past her maid's uniform to the woman underneath and had valued her not despite her education but because of who she'd chosen to become. "It doesn't matter," she'd finally said. "Even if I do love him, we come from completely different worlds. He's Korean Mafia royalty. I'm a Nigerian immigrant working as his housekeeper. That's not a romance story. That's a scandal waiting to destroy both of us. Or, Chikwudi had said softly, it's the kind of love story Mama always told us about, the kind that changes the world because it refuses to accept the world's limitations. Before Chioma could respond, her phone had buzzed with a video call. Jiwoo's face had filled the screen, the child already in her bed in Seoul where it was morning, her eyes red from crying. Chioma, Jiwoo had said, and the relief in her voice had been palpable. I had a bad dream. You weren't there. I'm here now, my precious girl, Chioma had said, angling the phone so Jiwoo could see Chikwudi in the hospital bed behind her. And look, this is my brother. Chikwudi, say hello to Jiwoo. Chikwudi had managed a weak wave, and Jiwoo had smiled through her tears. Hi, Uncle Chikwudi. I'm glad you're getting the medicine. Chioma loves you very much. She talks about you all the time. And she talks about you too. Chikwudi had replied in careful Korean he'd been learning through language apps. Thank you for sharing your Chioma with me. And thank you for helping save my life. What none of them could have known was that Minho was standing just outside Jiwoo's bedroom door, listening to this conversation, and making decisions that would alter the course of all their lives. The next morning, Choi Dae-young's office in Gangnam's most exclusive high-rise had felt like walking into a beautifully decorated cage. Park Yuna had arrived precisely on time, wearing armor disguised as a Dior suit, her fear hidden behind layers of makeup and arrogance. Her uncle had been standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city he controlled through fear and violence, and when he turned to face her, his smile had been the kind that made smart people run. Yuna, he'd said warmly, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Sit. We need to discuss your little competition. It's not going well, Yuna had admitted, seeing no point in lying to a man who had informants everywhere. Minho is clearly attached to his daughter's nanny, a Nigerian woman named Chioma Okafor. She's currently in Lagos visiting her sick brother. But when she returns, she won't be a problem, Dae-young had interrupted smoothly, because I have a proposition for you, one that benefits us both. Yuna had leaned forward, desperate and hating herself for it. What kind of proposition? I have exclusive access to a Swiss medical clinic. Very specialized. Very expensive. They handle rare genetic conditions that most hospitals can't touch. He'd paused, watching her face. Conditions like the one killing Jiwoo. The blood had drained from Yuna's face. Jiwoo is sick? Dying? Dae-young had corrected. Minho has been trying to find treatment for 18 months. Standard procedures have maybe a 30% success rate. But my clinic in Switzerland? 95% survival rate for her specific condition. How do you know all this? I make it my business to know everything about my enemies, Dae-young had said simply. And Kong Minho has been my enemy for a very long time. He doesn't know I was the one who ordered his wife's assassination. He thinks it was the Yakuza faction we framed. But eventually he'll figure it out. When he does, he'll come for me with everything he has. Unless what? Unless we're family, Dae-young had said, his smile widening. Here's my offer. You marry Minho. I provide Jiwoo's treatment through my Swiss connections, completely free. The child lives. Minho is grateful. You secure your position as his wife. I secure a permanent alliance with his organization. Everyone wins. Except Chioma, Yuna had said quietly. A Nigerian maid is a small price to pay for a child's life. Don't you think? Dae-young had leaned back in his chair. Of course, there are conditions. The maid has to go. Permanently. Not just fired, removed from Jiwoo's life completely. Deported back to Nigeria on some fabricated immigration violation. Maybe we discover she's been working illegally, or that her visa has irregularities. Once she's gone and can't return, Jiwoo will bond with you. Children, they forget. Yuna had felt sick, but she'd also felt the weight of her $50 million debt, felt the shadow of the Chinese triad leader her uncle would sell her to if she failed, felt the desperation of a woman with no good choices left. What about the other candidates? Use them, Dae-young had said dismissively. They're all desperate for their own reasons. Unite them against the common enemy, the foreign maid stealing their opportunity. Make it about protecting Ji-woo from inappropriate influences. Make it about Korean values and family preservation. They'll follow your lead if you convince them it's righteous. And if Minho refuses? If he loves Chioma? Then we make him choose, Dae-young had said coldly. Between his pride and his daughter's life. Between the woman he desires and the child he adores. That's not a choice. That's just basic math. He'll sacrifice the maid to save Ji-woo. And when he does, when he breaks both their hearts for his daughter's survival, you'll be there to pick up the pieces. To become the mother who saved the child's life. That's a bond that transcends love, Yuna. That's loyalty born from shared trauma. Yuna had stared at her uncle, recognizing the evil in his plan and hating that it made perfect, terrible sense. He has 48 hours, Dae-young had continued. I'll make contact tomorrow with the offer. Swiss clinic access in exchange for your marriage and Chioma's permanent removal from their lives. Minho will have 2 days to decide. And trust me, when a parent has to choose between their ego and their child's survival, the child always wins. Yuna had stood on shaking legs. You're asking me to destroy an innocent woman's life. I'm asking you to survive, Dae-young had corrected, and to help save a dying child in the process. If Chioma truly loves Ji-woo as much as you claim, she'll understand. She'll leave voluntarily. She'll make the sacrifice herself rather than watch the child die. Either way, she's gone, you're in, and everyone gets what they need. Well, he'd smiled. Almost everyone. After Yuna had left, Dae-young had made a phone call to Switzerland, confirming the arrangements. Then he'd made another call to his immigration contacts in the Korean government, preparing the documents that would make Chioma Okafor's deportation look legitimate and irreversible. And finally, he'd looked at the photograph on his desk. A surveillance photo of Minho's wife's car riddled with bullets, the assassination he'd ordered, the crime that had started this entire chain of events. Soon, Minho, he'd whispered to the photograph. Soon you'll know what it feels like to lose everything you love. And this time, you won't even know who to blame. 3 days later, the call came. Minho had been in his office reviewing security footage when his private line rang. The number only a handful of people knew. When he'd answered, Choi Dae-young's voice had filled the line like poison spreading through clean water. Minho, we need to talk about your daughter. Every muscle in Minho's body had gone rigid. If you're calling to threaten Ji-woo. Threaten? Dae-young had laughed. No, old friend. I'm calling to save her life. The silence that followed had been heavy with implications. I know about her condition. Dae-young had continued smoothly. The same genetic disease. I know you've been searching for treatment options for 18 months. I know the standard procedures have a 30% survival rate at best. And I know that's not good enough for you. Get to the point, Minho had said through clenched teeth. I have exclusive access to a clinic in Switzerland. They specialize in exactly this kind of rare genetic condition. 95% success rate. State-of-the-art treatment. Ji-woo could be completely cured within 6 months. Minho's heart had started racing despite his attempt to remain calm. What's the price? 2 things, Dae-young had said. First, you marry my niece, Park Yuna. Cement our family alliance. Combine our organizations. It's good business, Minho. You know it is. And second, the Nigerian woman, Chioma Okafor. She leaves Korea. Permanently. Deported back to Lagos on immigration violations we'll arrange. No contact with you or Ji-woo ever again. Clean break. The rage that had flooded through Minho had been white-hot and barely controlled. You want me to destroy an innocent woman's life. I want you to save your daughter's life, Dae-young had interrupted. Everything else is just details. You have 48 hours to decide. Swiss clinic access and Ji-woo lives. Or keep your pride and your foreign maid. And watch your daughter die the same way your wife did. Your choice. The line had gone dead. Minho had sat in his office for a long time after that call, staring at the security monitor that showed Ji-woo's empty bedroom. The Ankara blanket Chioma had given her still spread across the bed, and he'd felt the kind of helpless fury that came from being trapped between impossible choices. He could sacrifice Chioma, the woman who'd crossed an ocean to honor a promise to his dead wife, who'd given up her career and her life to heal his daughter, who'd taught Jiwoo what unconditional love looked like, and saved Jiwoo's life. Or he could refuse Dae-young's deal, maintain his integrity and protect Chioma, and watch his daughter die within 2 years. It wasn't a choice. It was torture disguised as decision-making. But as Minho sat there in the darkness of his office, something his wife had said before she died came back to him. "Promise me something," Hygiene had whispered. "When the darkness comes, and it will come, my love, don't make decisions from fear. Make them from faith. Trust that love finds a way even when we can't see the path." Minho had promised. And now, facing the worst decision of his life, he realized he had to honor that promise one final time. He picked up his phone and called Marcus Thompson. "Marcus, I need you to find out everything about Choi Dae-young's Swiss clinic connection. Everything. I need to know if it's real, if it's legitimate, and most importantly, I need to know what he's not telling me." "You think it's a trap?" "I think desperate men make dangerous offers," Minho had replied. "And I need to know the whole truth before I make a choice that will destroy lives either way." What Minho didn't know was that in Lagos, Chioma had received a very different call. From Park Yuna, her voice shaking with something that might have been guilt or fear or both. "Chioma, this is Yuna. I need to tell you something. My uncle is going to offer Minho a deal, treatment for Jiwoo in exchange for your deportation and my marriage to him. The treatment is real. The clinic is real. Without it, Jiwoo will die. With it, she'll live. But only if you leave Korea forever." Chioma had gripped the phone so hard her knuckles had turned pale. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm not a monster," Yuna had whispered. "I'm desperate and I've done terrible things because of it. But I'm not cruel enough to let you be blindsided. You deserve to know. You deserve to make your own choice." "What choice?" Chioma had asked, tears already streaming down her face. "Stay and watch Jiwoo die? Or leave and break both our hearts but save her life? That's not a choice." "I know," Yuna had said quietly. "I'm sorry. For everything. For how we treated you, for the cruelty, for the racism disguised as concern. You were right about all of us, we're just desperate women making monstrous choices. But this choice, this one is yours to make. Not Minho's. Not my uncle's. Yours." The call had ended, and Chioma had sat in her brother's hospital room, where Chikwudi was already responding to treatment, his color returning, his strength rebuilding, and she'd understood with devastating clarity what she had to do. She'd made a promise to Jiwoo's mother, to protect the child, to love her, to teach her that love transcends everything. And sometimes the most powerful expression of love was knowing when to let go. 2 days later, Minho received a video message from Chioma, recorded in Lagos, her brother sitting beside her looking healthier than he had in months, both of them wearing traditional Igbo clothing. Minho had pressed play with shaking hands. "Minho!" Chioma's voice had filled his office, and even through the screen he could see she'd been crying. "I've heard about the offer, about the choice you're facing, and I need you to know something you don't have to choose. I'm making the choice for you." "Chi, what are you?" he'd started to say to the screen, but the recording had continued. "Jiwoo's life is more important than my heart. More important than what we were starting to become. More important than anything. I came to Korea to honor a promise to her mother, to protect her, to love her, to give her everything she needed. And right now, what she needs is to live. So I'm leaving. Not because anyone is forcing me. Because I'm choosing to." Minho had felt his heart shatter. "Tell Jiwoo that I love her more than any ocean is wide. Tell her that this isn't goodbye forever, it's just goodbye for now. Tell her that love doesn't end because of distance. It just changes shape." Chioma had wiped tears from her face. "And tell her that her mother was right. Love does find a way, even when we can't see the path." The video had shifted to show Chikwudi, who'd spoken in careful Korean. "Mr. Kong, my sister is the bravest person I know. She's making this sacrifice so your daughter can live. Please don't waste it. Save Jiwoo. Love her the way Chioma taught you to. And someday, when the darkness passes and the path becomes clear again, maybe our families will find each other once more." The video had ended with Chioma's face filling the screen one last time. "I love you both," she'd whispered. "May Chinik protect you until we meet again." The screen had gone black. Minho had sat there in his office, the video message playing on loop, and he'd felt something inside him break and rebuild simultaneously. Chioma had just made the most selfless sacrifice imaginable. She'd given up everything so his daughter could live, had walked away from the family she'd found so Jiwoo would have a future. And in doing so, she'd shown him exactly what his wife had been trying to tell him before she died. That love wasn't about holding on. It was about letting go when necessary, about sacrifice, about choosing the other person's life over your own happiness. Chioma had chosen Jiwoo's life. Now Minho had to decide what that sacrifice meant for all of them. If you've been holding your breath through this journey, if your heart is racing, if you need to know what happens next, then you need to hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notification bell, because part 2 of this story is coming and you absolutely cannot miss it. The question isn't whether Minho accepts Dae-young's deal. It's what he discovers about that deal that changes everything. What he learns about his wife's death, about Chioma's connection to it all, and about a weapon his wife left behind that could destroy the entire Korean underworld. Like this video, if Chioma's sacrifice broke your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that real love sometimes means letting go. And drop a comment telling me, what would you do if you had to choose between love and saving a life? Because the answers to that question will determine everything that happens next. Share this video with someone you love. Because stories like this remind us that the most powerful thing in the world isn't money or status or power. It's the courage to love anyway, even when it costs us everything. Thank you for watching. And remember, this isn't the end. It's just the beginning of a war fought not with weapons, but with the only thing that's ever truly mattered: love.